Hello, thank you for joining us. This is the fourth in the series of Scholars for Healing and Racial Reconciliation. My name is Dr. Sharmon Monagan. I'm based in Atlanta. I'm the principal organizer. I have a PhD in conflict analysis and resolution, and I'm the author of Fascist Trump, How Donald Trump's Rhetoric is Jeopardizing U.S. National Security. Along with me, we have two panelists, top experts in conflict analysis and resolution. First, I have Dr. Bobby Huen. Bobby has an advanced degree in international relations and conflict analysis and resolution. He is an expert in online activism, social movements, and communications. He is the founder of BH Conflict Resolution, a consulting and mediation firm in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And next we have Dr. Wynona James. Wynona is the Negotiation Dispute Resolution Manager with the newly formed United States Space Force in Colorado Springs, Colorado, where she serves as a senior mediator and senior civil rights practitioner. Dr. James has a bachelor's degree in sociology, and her PhD is in conflict analysis and resolution. She is a senior adjunct faculty member with Abilene Christian University in their graduate conflict management program. So today, as with the other series, we're going to be dealing with the two dominant issues in our society today, which are the global pandemic, COVID-19, and racism. So first we'll start with Dr. Bobby Huen.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Okay, fantastic. I want to start with the idea that COVID-19 hasn't changed things as much as it has accelerated things. In the age of globalization and the rejection and the counter reaction to and the reaction towards this rapid globalization is already evident in the days before the pandemic. We are talking about Europe, for example. In Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, they have become increasingly illiberal. And by illiberal, I mean, although democratically elected, these the ruling parties such as Orbán in Hungary and the Law and Justice Party, if I got it correctly, in Poland, has already embarked on a journey towards censoring speech they don't like, harassing journalists, and imposing their religious views on the general population. For example, Orbán in Hungary is notorious for using George Soros as a scapegoat, using not quite veiled anti-Semitic rhetoric. But COVID accelerated this process. In Europe, where for the last couple of decades, where open borders are the norm, suddenly borders are closing. People are circling their wagons in times of crisis. Severe economic impact of the virus has yet to be determined, but it is going to be extremely severe for every country on Earth. In times of trouble, we are seeing people running towards nationalism like never before. I mean, we have already seen Brexit, and the truth is we're not entirely sure if the pan-European experiments can survive without dedicated help from the leaders themselves. Now, the COVID has also led to certain countries taking advantage of the power vacuum or the lack of they took advantage of the distraction caused by COVID in order to make international moves that we might not have been so forgiving. For example, China's aggression towards Hong Kong, a city that I was born and raised in before moving to the United States, is now under siege by the communist government of Beijing, passing a law that essentially would allow them to arrest political dissidents and whisking them off to mainland China to stand trial and face dire consequences for opposing the Beijing government and narrative. Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, has been consolidating his power using a combination of proposal of economic prosperity and brutal crackdown to justify said economic prosperity, exercising his power in a way that has not been seen in Chinese government, not been seen in some time. The idea that all this power is now consolidated into one person and one faction of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, of course, when it comes to international relations, we are now seeing a period of extreme contention between almost all major powers. Russia is making moves, of course, against the United States. China is now locked in a quasi-Cold War with the United States, thanks to enormous, let's just say, astounding incompetency in terms of international relations of the Trump administration. And we are seeing the US influence diminishing across the globe, while China is taking advantage of this vacuum and engineering their rise in power. Now, militarily, US is still ahead in most ways, but we are seeing we're seeing China exercising its soft power across the world in an attempt to essentially win over countries by building them things. China has made great inroads in Africa, and I do not think that the COVID crisis has changed all that much in that regard. And meanwhile, since Trump administration is extremely adept in alienating every government that we have a relationship with, we are facing the US is facing a crisis in the standing of the world. Anyways, but COVID-19 also brings an unexpected silver lining. I think, and I'm just proposing a theory here based on my observation, that COVID-19 helped boost the crisis caused by the murder of George Floyd to the forefront of domestic issues, with millions of people confined at home and being unemployed and being in economic dire straits, has finally encouraged people who are not persons of color, communities of color, to recognize the brutality of police oppression on people of color. We are now seeing widespread support of the Black Lives Matter movement, and although, of course, there's a ferocious backlash against that. But the fact that the movement has gained a lot more traction during now, as opposed to the Ferguson protests several years ago, has indicated to me that a lot of people who would otherwise be not paying attention to the Black Lives Matter movement or the murders of George Floyd and other racial minorities, had it not been for COVID essentially freezing society. It hit the society hit a pause button because of the pandemic, and now everyone are watching. They don't have busy lives to return to, and with their personal livelihoods at stake, I think there are a lot more empathy about the systemic injustice, especially economic injustice, faced by a lot of people who would otherwise be blind to in the sheer wealth disparity of this country. We are now reckoning with things that would otherwise be unseen. Anyways, so I think I'll start with that, and let's go ahead and Dr. James, if you want to say something.
Well, I tell you, Dr. Huen, that I am feeling very honored to go behind you, and the information that you shared so insightful. I'd like to thank Dr. Monagan for the opportunity to be with the panel this afternoon, and just find it a wonderful opportunity, just this whole platform that we have spent the previous weeks and even today as to providing insight as far as what can be done, or just even this is a catalyst to move forward with opportunities to assist not only in the scholar role or the environment, but also as far as the public populace, and that everyone can glean some kind of insights. So Dr. Huen, you provided some just insightful things from an international perspective. And thank you, Dr. Monagan, for having me. I'd like to look at the topic that we're talking about as far as the pandemic, global pandemic, and racism from a practitioner perspective and application. That seems to be where I really have had a passion for some time now, that actually drove me into or the desire to explore research and my postgraduate work in conflict analysis and resolution. So I'd like to start by sharing that a little bit about myself from a perspective to set the platform of where I'm coming from. Is I was fortunate to grow up in a military family background, and the culture, military, government. And my formative years, even though I'm a Colorado resident, have been for years. I won't date myself as to how long, but my formative years was when my father was conducting his service on the Canadian Upper Peninsula, Michigan border. So a lot of the culture is, as far as junior high through high school, is Canadian culture. And I share that because that was during the early 60s to 70s. And so we were removed from what the country experienced as far as the civil rights, the bloody 60s. Being that North, we heard about it, we saw the things that occurred, the family heritage. My family, we are Tennesseans. Yet we were removed, and it was only through communication with family, media, that we saw what was going on. So I come from a neutral perspective, from not being directly impacted by the nucleus of what was occurring with racial conflict, yet and still being a family with heritage that goes all the way back to the Civil War. I have two relatives that served in the 14th Colored Infantry, as well as relatives that were slaves that came out of Bedford, Virginia. So it's still, and just the fact that being ethnically a Black person and experiencing racism, even generational as well as current present time, I think that was something that was identified in earlier presentations we had with the panel. My background, so being in that environment, I've always had a curiosity as why do people are not able to be cordial, have harmony. When we were in the military environment, that was something that was advocated. It goes back even to Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, when he was in as a general as well as a president. He was one of the first to make an effort as far as resolving segregation, discrimination with the military forces. And he posed that if the military were fractured, by not being together and having this separatism between blacks and whites even living in the barracks, then how can they fight and do their mission as far as military soldiers? So he was one of the first, and I share that there was still a lot of work it's not to say it was easy at all, yet and still he provided, he was, I think, the forefront of that effort that was made, and it makes a lot of sense. So we were in a situation that had mandates that military, blacks and whites, took care of one another. Again, lots of disparity, lots of things that were painful for the minority black soldiers. Yet and still there was those efforts. So from that perspective, there we got along. The foundational things: respect, dignity, and I'm seeing that from a child perspective. Yet growing up, it was really important to understand, like, why again is there not harmony? Why are people fighting? What is there about race that makes a difference? And just to fast forward, my research, which I did in depth on what we're talking about, the title was "The Imprint of Racism, a Phenomenological Study on White Adult Males' Exposure to Racial Antipathy, Historical Stereotypes, and Polarization Towards African American and Blacks, and the Men's Transformational Journey Towards Racial Reconciliation." And while there was a lot of elements to the research that I accomplished, it really came down to, which was like an amazing, insightful phenomena, that it was their familial, generational ideologies, and specifically the father figure, that made what came to be my title, "The Imprint of Racism and Antipathy, Hatred." And from that, though, the other element, like I said, there was a lot of moving parts, but ultimately the conclusion, which was one of the theoretical points that was made, was they also talk about their journey and how they moved into racial reconciliation from a spiritual perspective. And so that's where I come to the panel today, as that focus that people have the ability to change, and yet and still with it, the other elements is the pain that has gone with it. One of the participants, he described the transformation as that of an alcoholic. He said that the imprint was always with him. It was like somebody being exposed to something, or even children, and something that they shouldn't see, or any of us for that matter. And then it's there, it's the truth, it's the story, it's the fact. And so therefore it doesn't go away. And with what they grew up, and the pain, the hatred, some of them were from white supremacist hate groups, and the things that they were exposed to, and they say they have to work extra hard. So from that came what was trauma, and it's not only post-traumatic stress from a present tense, but Dr. DeGruy, in her book Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, posits that everyone, as Americans, because of slavery being the sin of America, it has impacted on, just us as a nation, the trauma that experience. And so from that perspective, we see the social psychological impact. And from there, we see a good example, if I can integrate it with the COVID, is how people are fearful. Number one, medicine, the medical, the physiological fear. The other is when the nation, and even our leaders from all perspectives, and especially the states, we know that that's a very controversial topic now, is wearing masks. And the leaders saying, you will wear the masks, it will help. And there's back and forth dialogue on that. That in itself, it moves into, even by what we're seeing, and removing even the political part, but the black and white, the medical, as far as when we look at what would be the institutional racism, the care, the medical care. Yet we've heard media and our experts in journalism cite that, you know, the population, some populations are greater to wear the masks than the other populations. And we see now when it's mandated, there are some feeling like that their rights are going to be taken away. There is that fear. And I possess also during my research that when you look at the foundational emotion of fear, and which is defined that when someone feels threatened that something's going to be taken away, that moves and can go into Steinberg's work, Steinberg, where they do the theory of hatred. It's the stages, and all of that is the origination of fear. And so therefore, if that occurs and hatred manifests, it is they hate that person. It's that mental process that occurs that can either be where it's detriment to other people, individuals, or groups, as well as even fatal, which brings us to what happened with the George Floyd, the fear, and even things that are almost to the pitch of where there's harm to the communities. So what does all of this say? I can talk about it, and my biggest advocacy is, so what? If someone said, Dr. James, so what? The so what is, what are we going to do about it? And that's where I turn the corner to what is reconciliation. And that's from the spiritual perspective that I advocate that the church has an opportunity to be that change agent for reconciliation. Now, be mindful, the church is not, this should not be on the shoulders of only the church and religious communities, organizations. But I believe that it is a catalyst, because there is the greatest scripture that is in biblical is Matthew, is in the book of Matthew, that says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will become children of God." And so therefore, that in itself shows that God has made man as to be harmonious with others. As such, it led to my research, a very powerful as far as the historical, even we're talking 2,000 years ago. The greatest hater that we had in history was the Apostle Paul. And before he came Apostle Paul, he was the Apostle Saul. He was Saul, which was a taxpayer, and I say the greatest hater because he hated Christians to the degree that the way he harmed them was tragic. Very brutal. Some of the things that we unfortunately are hearing that's happening, but even more so. Yet Paul had the opportunity, as these men that I interviewed and researched, to change their hearts. So change becomes a heart thing. And when Paul changed Saul changed and had his experience on the Damascus Road, which is identified in the book of Acts, he became Paul and one of the great disciples and advocates of a peacemaker. And it just shows the power of the spiritual perspective. Now, the church has the opportunity by what I'd like to just close by saying, or just my piece here, is that I was able to research, one in particular is called Mission Mississippi, and then the other organization is the Episcopal Church itself. And they have what's called reconciliation healing groups. And they do this periodically with workshops, annual, biannual seminars. And it's not a matter of just sharing the stories, but it's really getting in the depth of the heart of the matter and the emotion and helping one another understand. And it's not just a one-way street where it is, you know, black sharing the story and then whites, okay, yeah, that's how you feel. But it's also the mutual exchange of people understanding one another. And so I just find that to be fascinating, which moves us into what I'd like to advocate, or is what's called regenerative justice. It's one that the theory that I was able to coin with my one of my dissertation mentors, Dr. Torrin Hansen. And regenerative justice is infused in restorative justice, where it is this opportunity for individuals to share really how it harmed them, with all of the opportunity for reconciliation. Dr. Monagan?
Thank you, Dr. James. You did a very good job. So I'm going to be talking to you all about national security and race, which is touchy. So let me start off by saying I do not condone violence, nor am I calling for violence. And it's important for me to say that as a Black woman, because sometimes our words are intentionally misconstrued to fit a narrative. So a white scholar could say the same thing and they would be lauded as being brilliant and so forward thinking, whereas with people of color, we have to be very careful in how we frame our public discourse. So I want to put that out there explicitly from the beginning so that we can move forward and have an honest conversation about race and national security. And so I want to kind of tackle this issue from a several different perspectives. So I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of Blacks. I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of white supremacy, international relations, and the field of national security itself. So what we've seen is that we've never seen a period in our history in the US where you've had mobs of Black people to go out and attack white communities. What we have seen are mobs of white people attacking Black, mostly prosperous communities. The one that we've heard a lot about recently is the Tulsa massacre, or the destruction of Black Wall Street. That community was destroyed for no other reason other than they were a Black prosperous community. But there's a history of this. From the period of 1917 to 1923, that's called the Red Summer, there were over 97 lynchings, recorded lynchings. That's important that we include that word, recorded lynchings, because I'm sure that there were others that were not officially reported, investigated, or recorded. So 97 recorded lynchings. There were thousands of Black people that were maimed and killed. There were thousands of Black-owned homes and businesses that were burned down and destroyed during this period. And this occurred across 26 cities in this country. And to this day, no one has ever been held accountable for any of those massacres, whether it was the East St. Louis, Illinois massacre, the Elaine, Arkansas, Washington, D.C., Tulsa, or Rosewood massacres. No one has ever been held accountable for that. And what you have now in this generation, unlike the previous generation of civil rights activists that didn't just have a mindset of nonviolence, they were trained in the tactics of nonviolence. This generation does not want nonviolence. They want equality and justice. And they're willing to use violent means. They're willing to take to the street and protest and riot because that's what seems to get the attention of people in power. Because it seems that people have become numb, or I don't even know if it's something that they've become numb to, or if they've always been numb to the cries, the pain, and the tears of Black people. And this generation is not trying to hear it. They suffered. Unlike other generations, my parents' generation was that generation that came through Jim Crow and moved into Black middle class. My generation reaped the benefits of that middle class and reaped the benefits of excesses and materialism, which gave us a false sense of well-being. We thought we were doing well because we were able to buy that luxury car, live in suburbia, have the swimming pool, and all of the trappings of being in a good state. Meanwhile, Black men and women still were being disproportionately killed by police with impunity. And so this generation has been raised and they've seen that. They've lived through 9/11. They lived through the economic crisis where they've seen their parents work hard and lose their jobs and lose their homes. So they have a different mindset and a different mentality. So it's incumbent upon all of us to actually deal with national security because it puts all of us at risk. It's not just a Black-white thing. white people suffer from racism, whether they realize it or want to not acknowledge it or not. Especially if you happen to be poor white, you suffer from racism just as much as Black people do, because those laws and policies and institutions that are set up to be racist towards Black people entrap poor whites into that system as well. From a white supremacist perspective, we saw that during the Obama administration, you had an influx, just a rapid off the charts influx of white supremacist organizations. And people can say that the Tea Party or these white supremacist groups were about the economy. It was about, they were mad that there was a Black man in the White House. That's what it was. And the media was dishonest about it. They were really skeptical about calling it out for what it was. And because they didn't, it let it fester. And now this is what we're reaping at this point. This is the manifestation of allowing that stuff to incur and to seep into the rims of our government without calling it for what it is. And so white supremacy is a national security issue, because if you have if you have a national security infrastructure that is predominantly white male, they don't see other white males as threats. But most of our domestic terrorist attacks over the past few years have been white supremacist terrorist attacks, whether it was attacks because of ethnicity, race, or religious minority groups. That's been the basis of these attacks. And for the first time this year, in April 2020, surprisingly, the Trump administration labeled a white supremacist group as a terrorist organization. That was the Russian Imperial Movement. They labeled them as a terrorist organization, but it's so hard to get white men who don't naturally have a fear, because that's not the other, to label a white group as a terrorist organization. But here's the thing, it's not just that they hate Black people, which is a problem in and of itself, but the goal of these white supremacist groups is a race war. That's the end game. That's what they've been pushing for. And that poses a threat to our national security. And here's the thing about racism. Racism has tentacles. It doesn't just stay confined to a person hating another person because of their race. Races normally are also misogynistic. They're xenophobic. They're homophobic. They're anti-Semitic. They don't just hate Black people. If you sit down and dig a little bit deeper, they hate all kinds of people across the spectrum. So it poses a threat to all of us, and it's incumbent upon all of us to deal with it as a threat. But part of that is also looking at the threat from the outside in. When we think about national security, we think about keeping our home front safe. And part of that is dealing with the threats from outside. And one of the threats that we've seen, throughout our recent history, but really making a mark in our past election, and unfortunately, because nothing has been done, it will play a role in this upcoming election, is the role of Russia. Russia did not create the racial division here, but they exploited it. The former NSA head, Michael Hayden, said that covert influence campaigns don't create divisions on the ground. They amplify the divisions that already exist on the ground. So racism has always existed, and Russia has always done a good job about amplifying that racial divide, because divide and conquer is not a new tactic. It's just that because of the internet, they have more of an impact. They can do more of the racial division. So they ran a lot of those ads in 2016 that targeted Black people and said, don't vote because both politicians are the same, or don't vote for this politician because she's just as bad and she thinks Black people are, super predators, and don't look at what's going on in the United States. You shouldn't vote. They don't think or care anything about you, anything. Look at Freddie Gray, look at this, spat of unarmed Black men being killed by police. So they preyed on those feelings that already existed. So we have to be very mindful about that. because they will continue to do that and exploit the racism that exists in our country if we do not come to the table and honestly deal with it. And the last area that I wanted to talk about when it comes to national security is the field of national security itself. When Nelson Mandela was released from prison and he became the president of South Africa, he did this interview with Ted Koppel. And one of the questions kind of challenged him about his relationship with Colonel Gaddafi and Fidel Castro. And this is a paraphrase of what he said, but he said, the mistake that you all make in the West is to think that your enemy is my enemy. And when it comes to national security, if you only have one set of people in there, they tend to think that that our enemy is everybody else's enemy. And when you're dealing with international relations and geopolitical formations, it's not that cut and dry. People make alliances and just dissolve those alliances, based on a lot of different factors. And with President Mandela, his point was that even though the United States had a problem with Gaddafi and with Castro, he said during apartheid, those men in their countries stood by their side as South Africans. They rejected apartheid while America was silent in the face of apartheid for so long. And so you have Dr. Susan Rice, the former national security advisor. She said within the national security arena, the thing is white, male, and Yale. Well, that shows such a lack of diversity, not just in gender, because a lot of times when we talk about diversity, the first thing that companies do is go out and hire white women and they say, okay, we've done our job, we're more diverse. But it goes beyond just gender diversity. White, male, and Yale, even within the arena, and if it's just Yale and Harvard graduates, you leave out a lot of people because institutions have cultures. Colleges and universities have cultures, and they have a different way of knowing and understanding things. So if you have people that only come from one frame of thought, then you leave out everyone else. And the problem with that is you don't get buy-in. If you don't have people buying in, if you don't feel like national security applies to everyone, it applies to all Americans, then you're not going to get that assistance when, you have our agencies coming in to investigate, a Muslim sect, or if you have coming into the Black community because there's something that poses a national security threat, because there's no buy-in. There's nobody there that looks like me. There's nobody there that thinks like me. There's nobody that has my sensibility. So it's very important for there to be buy-in. And then the other thing I just really want to reiterate is that if you just have white, male, and Yale, and you have white domestic terrorists, they don't see them as a threat. And it's important for them to see them for the threat that they are and not see them as an equal or a colleague. You have to get beyond their race and look at their actions. So that's what I have to say about national security. I want to kind of open the dialogue up, and I wanted to go to Dr. Bobby Huen. And you and I had a brief conversation when we were talking about this panel discussion, and you talked about how COVID exposed something in that Chinese immigrants had been seen as the model immigrants. And COVID really kind of burst that bubble of them seeing themselves and also as Americans seeing them as the model immigrants. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sharmon. Anyways, and when we were having that discussion, I was referring to the common perception, especially by certain segments of white America, who thinks that Asians are, quote unquote, the model minority. We are not, Asians as a whole are not until recently, are not very political active demographic in American politics. a lot of them are small business owners. They tend to be conservative, but that has been rapidly changing. We are now more Democratic leaning than Republican leaning. But COVID also, and actually not just COVID, but the administration's response to COVID has led to a turning point in how Asian Americans see themselves and their place in America. When the president of a country is literally trying to use, every time he opens his mouth, he said the China virus, the Chinese virus. That is stoking fear against the Chinese community. Now, I'm not saying that the Chinese community are always the best, the whole model minority thing is almost certainly a myth. I'm also kind of upset about certain certain Asian American activities, such as, for example, suing Harvard because they're not admitting enough Asian people, although Asians now represent a quarter of college population in some universities. Really. And the idea, and I think there are a lot of misconceptions about the Asian community. The idea that we are richer, smarter, a lot of us go to colleges, and therefore we are the elites, and that also stoke a certain sense of resentment. And of course, what COVID did, and I think what COVID accelerated, is the exposure of these racial resentments, the fault lines of racial resentments in this country and beyond. What Dr. James mentioned, white supremacists, white supremacy, and in my research for my dissertation on social movements and the internet, I also studied white supremacist movements on the internet. And what happened was, even before social media, there were niche websites and forums that specifically catered to white supremacists online. They are just like there were forums that deals with different kinds of demographics, including LGBT community, including to women, including to African Americans and other racial minorities. The white supremacist movement has always been a latent, hidden force online for quite some time. Now, what happens is social media has blown, and foreign intervention, for example, Russian intervention, but Russia is not the only country who tried to sway public opinion in the United States by manipulating the internet. The effect of online manipulation has amplified, and of course this administration's open embrace of white supremacists inside the administration and prioritizing their policy preferences, for example, on immigration and on on other policy aspects that deals with racial justice. We are looking at an amplification of an already existing voice. On the other hand, I would also say that the internet has also amplified voices that criticizes white supremacy too. We have people whose jobs on Twitter is basically calling out white supremacists. The people that we would otherwise not know, for example, your local business owner or your bigotry is now being exposed more and more often. I don't think people are becoming more bigoted, but I think they're being more likely to be exposed if they're bigoted now. That's a very important distinction to make. I don't think that racism in general is increasing. We are just seeing more of it because now everyone has a camera, everyone has Twitter, everyone has Facebook, And when you put your views, when you put your abhorrent views online, people are going to find it, people are going to expose you. And that's why, I mean, that's why the conservatives right now are so enraged about what is so-called cancel culture, right? The whole idea of calling out people who espouses bigotry and work to either get them, work to, make them face consequences for their actions. We are talking about people who get caught rejecting African American families from hotel pools or accosting them because they're making phone call in the hotel lobby. People are being caught. Those things happened before, but now they're being caught and they're being streamed on Facebook. And the consequences for some of these people were the loss of their jobs, or the loss of their position in the company, or even loss of entertainment opportunities. For example, in the case of Nick Cannon right now, who got caught sprouting anti-Semitism. I mean, I always like that line from Avenue Q: "Everyone is a little bit racist." And that's true. Racism and bigotry is not the sole prerogative of white America. We can all be a little racist. And trust me, as someone who is Asian living in the United States, I hear a lot of my fellow Asian people saying things that I would never say out loud. The whole, I think everyone harbors their own prejudices, and this is also a country founded by rebellion. We like the idea of being contrarian. That's why all the people refuse to wear masks. It's almost like we Americans have an automatic button just sitting inside their psyche that says "do not press," but we keep pressing it anyway because it says "do not press," and therefore I must press it. And so people reject masks just because the governments want them to wear one, for no other principle. The excuse of liberty is just an excuse. It is not really, they weren't concerned about liberty. They weren't concerned about freedom. They weren't concerned, these people are comparing wearing masks to the Holocaust, for God's sake. I'm like, what? What kind of excuses or what kind of mental gymnastics do you equate wearing masks to mandates about Holocaust and racial injustice? No, it's about wearing a mask. It's a piece of cloth. But this being a country that is founded on rebellion and embrace contrarianism in such a degree because everyone wants to argue about something, it becomes almost like a reflexive action of not obeying rules.
Well, I want to jump in really quick. So I will say, I think there's a difference between racism and prejudice. I think racism has more to do with power. I think all of us have some prejudices, but all of us don't have the power to carry those prejudices out against someone else. So I think that's the difference. The other thing is, I've noticed that I've been saying for years, I think one of the problems is that we lack empathy in this country. Not just in this country, I would say all over the world, we are lacking empathy. And one of the things I would like for people to do is to be more, to look more internally at our own actions. And because sometimes there's a lot of cognitive dissonance. What I've noticed was in the United States, you have people using the term, some people using this horrible trope of the Chinese flu, and it's causing Chinese Americans, or not even Chinese Americans, because I think some people are just so indifferent. They don't know one group of Asians from another. So it's causing attacks against Asian Americans. But then you have in China where they are discriminating against Africans and not, evicting them from their homes without any notice or anything, because they're saying you may have brought the flu here. or you may cause a second wave of the flu here. No testing or anything. So I want people to be a little bit more empathetic and look at people as people, look at people as human beings, because I think sometimes it's easy to pick certain human beings and demonize them. And it's not the groups of people, it's how we behave as individuals and the behaviors that we accept. I think back when we were in our program, we learned about some case where it was in one of our gender classes where it's like we can demonize white men and blame white men for violence and for discrimination and things like that and some of the horrible things. But there was a case where they took the priest out of this one setting and there were just nuns. And then in that setting, you had the nuns that became physically and sexually abusive. So it wasn't about the gender, it was about the power, not the gender. So I think we need to look more at that and get to the bottom of that. And why are we okay with some? I think we're very okay with the haves and have-nots. We're very okay with the idea of superior and inferior. So even if you had a monolithic society, people will find some kind of way to discriminate and to marginalize other people. And I think that's the thing we need to get to the bottom of.
You're absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct, Sharmon, because the lack of empathy permeates almost all aspects of global society right now. We are looking, in the times of crisis, we look inward and we reject, so we embrace the in-group and reject the out-group, right? So, and so who are in and who are out depends on who are not necessarily power, but there are also issues like essentially sheer numbers. For example, several decades ago, there has in Southeast Asia, there were several incidences of Chinese population in places in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Philippines, where Chinese people were ostracized and rejected from the country. They literally call it expel the Chinese people from their countries because they perceive the Chinese people as having too much power. There's still, if I remember correctly, I haven't checked recently, there are still laws in books in some of these countries where Chinese cannot own businesses without the participation from other demographics, including, for example, in Malaysia, you have to give a Malay, you have to have a co-investor who is Malay if you're Chinese, if you want to establish a business there. It was not. There seemed to be a fear that. Let me put it this way. They frame the same argument just like some people frame anti-Semitism. Jews are powerful, so in that case, Chinese are powerful, they're economically successful, so they're stealing our resources, that sort of thing. So prejudice that really frames a minority as overly powerful, frames a minority as like economically successful and therefore controlling the country and oppressing the majority. That trope applies to always a prosperous minority group, and they can and the majority do not want perceive it as a threat. So yes, rejection. So a lot of times prejudice are based on power, but it can also be driven by fear, like you said. In terms of empathy, I feel. Go ahead.
Let me get Dr. James to jump in. Dr. Sure. James, I wanted you to respond to what Bobby said, and my question for you after you respond to his ideas about prejudice, racism, and everything like that. I wanted to ask you. You talked about the responsibility of the church, and it's not the sole responsibility of the church, but the church does have a responsibility and a role in racial healing and reconciliation. But how is the church going to do that if our church is the most divided place in America? Churches are we're the most segregated on Sundays. That's the time that we're the most segregated and separated, divided from one another in this country. So how does the church actually play out their role in their part in causing racial healing and reconciliation if they are a part of the problem?
Well, I appreciate that. And if I can, as you mentioned, talk with what Bobby shared and even you, and then talking about that role, you bring out a good point, because it has been said, it is true, that Sunday is the most segregated, uh, day of the week. And I find that quite compelling, as you say, and then, based on it being around church. But I do have some insights on that. And I was listening and really appreciate the rich dialogue that you all were having in a number of areas. And I don't want to belabor the fact, but Bobby, you did mention about, and you also, Sharmon, about the empathy, the element of empathy. And what came to mind is that is so true. I've been fortunate to be doing some reading and always trying to glean on sources. And one that I've used even in the academic platform is Daniel Shapiro's work. He has a wonderful book called Negotiating the Non-Negotiable. And when you have highly charged emotional, settings where people just have their emotions in front of the inability to be able to be reasonable with what they are attempting to resolve. And even though he may be using that, and Daniel Shapiro, by the way, is a psychologist, he's with Harvard University and the founder, along with Roger Fisher, on the International Negotiation Program there. But he really has recognized that emotions play a big part and become the roadblock, the quicksand, as far as people being able to move towards reconciliation. When that becomes the blinder, then there's no success at all. And so I bring him up because he advocates how important it is to focus on the emotion. It's not so much of what the mutual parties or a group wants, but it's being the ability to recognize one's emotions to and how to gauge. And he uses tools and techniques he presents in his book on how all of us, even ourselves, that we've not become part of what I like to call the quicksand, getting stuck. And I brought that up because, Sharmon, you mentioned about something about the emotions earlier, and it just stuck with me. And part of that is the word you all use, which is that empathy. And we can't have empathy and understand others if not first we have done the work to understand ourselves. And Bobby, I think you mentioned it, that internal, that self-reflection. If we have not been able to work through that and be able to extend that with the olive branch, then we're handicapped, and therefore we do have that conflict. The other that you shared had to do with, and then what I was going to share on that is from the topic and bringing it back from a Christian perspective. And I think it's just the nature of man, the raw nature of man, be it spiritually or individually, is that man's physical being is with good and evil. And there that gets into the psychology, which that's not my specialty, depth of it, but just a matter of it is the cycle. I mean, when you think of just the general psychology of it, the conscious, the subconscious, and the ability to reason and make choices. Now, I bring that up because I find it interesting that when I speak of good and evil, or good and bad choices, and then this being scriptural, if we look at the beginning of Genesis, very first book, and God made Adam and Eve. And in that scripture, God tells Eve, do not eat of this fruit. You can have anything you want, but just don't do this. Now let's fast forward to the present time conditions. And the medical experts and everybody that's making an effort to try and get their hands around this terrible pandemic have said, do not distance yourselves. Don't go to the beaches. Don't go to public places. Yet and still, they had a choice. And the choice was stay home, be safe, let's eradicate this. Yet and still, folks went. And we see the results of that, I think, from just what I'm sharing from the platform of Scripture, and a choice that was made. And then the results of that choice is just as what happened biblically. There became where there was, a change as far as the choice or the blessings that Adam and Eve had. Tragically, we are seeing the results of what's happened with, we know, I mean, not unless there's something that I'm seeing or someone put a different, video on television with media, but we know that there was multiple places that had beaches that were almost packed. In some places, people were arm to arm like a sardines. And sadly, those places are now the highest pitch points as far as the virus. So I think that's just real important when we look at the choices that people make on that. I just love this subject, so I could go on, but I want to respect our time in the discussion. But you mentioned the responsibility of the church. And yes, I am sad to say that racism, slavery, some painful things when it comes to especially the Black race originated out of the church. History has shown that churches and great leaders, or perceived to be leaders, I won't say great because the things that were decisions have been painful, but that when Lincoln did the Emancipation Proclamation and freedom, one of the greatest groups of people, not only in history, but one during that era of time, the 1800s, was Margaret Sanger, who post-set or advocated for racial eugenics. And therefore, just a lot of harm, and I think it was one of the stepping stones for marginalization. Again, that fear threat, it had to do with economics and the haves and the have-nots, the have-nots getting more than the haves. And so that is one. The other is Frederick Hegel, a great philosopher from the 1700s who infused the idea, the ideology that people with black skin were not they're savage. He used very disdaining descriptors as far as blacks, and those things, when you put that into motion, they become conspiracies. Those were historical conspiracies, even some we hear today. And we move into even Charles Darwin, which I think was the greatest harmer to the lineage of humanity and how people look at one another, because again, he marginalized the Black race individuals, associate them, try to make associations alignment with primal, apes, and just some of the tragedies there. All of yet still, some of those, if we look at history, sadly came from the church. But all that said, are making an effort, and that olive branch has to be reached out. And I know even professionally, as well as community, just church, I've always said that people have got to want to be part of the solution process. Can you hear me? Can y'all hear me? Okay, I've lost. So we've got to. There's got to be people that want to be the example of solution, and I think I advocate that when people see something successful working, that the majority, it's not everybody, because Bobby, I think you said it, there's going to be some people that they just even mentally, it's ingrained them to be just haters. They're just evil. I'm sorry to say that, but research has shown that. And I think that goes into a whole nother topic. But first, there's got to be people that say, I want to come to the table. And that's where I say that I have seen through the research I did how, and I'm going to, again, this group is the Episcopal Church. And it's called Mission Mississippi in Jackson, Mississippi, with the uh, the originator, what do you want to call it, the individual that pioneered it, Dr. Nettier Winter, and it has become a community opportunity. They've been doing it almost 20 years, and it is blacks and whites that come together and communicate how, and also work towards reconciliation. The Episcopalian Church actually has almost what I want to call peace circles. And when you look at conflict circles or peace circles or communication circles, that is something that's ancient too, and it goes into tribal circles. Native American use it as far as coming and convening, and there's something powerful with those kind of communication platforms. Now, be mindful, it's not going to change. I mean, and I don't think that, sadly, with everything that and efforts, we see it with what Dr. King has done. God bless John Lewis's soul, being one of those advocates and the hard work. But when we, again, foundationally have to deal with what the core of humanity is about, which is that good and evil, I think it's a matter of not sitting back as New Testament says, with some of the churches, and some that are great and on fire, and then others that say, oh, we've got it good now, and they become lukewarm. We cannot, it is a continual opportunity to exercise. It's almost like a muscle. If you don't use it, you lose it. But I really think we could apply that same theoretical process as to reconciliation. You know, marriages you have to work hard with. And there's always, if you turn and get slow, or like I said, lukewarm, then things happen. And I think it's the same principle for reconciliation. Sharmon, you're so true. There's still a lot that the churches have to do, and some denominations are looking at reconciliation because of that harm. And I think it came from the historical harm. And then the current generation, they're recognizing, as my research participants, oh, I got a bad sale. I got snake oil as a indicator instead of what was true. But we don't know those relations by getting into each other's stuff. I always say, do you really want to know me? Bobby, do you really want to know me? Or is it just because of residency? You sound nice, you look good, you break some of the stereotypes that maybe someone or even me came in. I'm just saying that's example. But have I really gotten to know you? And that's where I think the beauty of reconciliation is.
Well, I will just say for myself that sometimes we can get so angry when we see these videos of unarmed Black men and women being killed by police, or as we go through our daily lives and we experience these microaggressions. It's easy to get into the mindset where we do the same thing that we don't want white people to do, which is to put us into a group. And it's like, oh, well, all white people are like this, and I feel this way about all white people. But I know for me, what has helped is going to a church that is very diverse. So when I get to that point where I want to think a certain way and have that mindset, always think about my church family and wonder, no, that doesn't apply to Ellen, or that doesn't apply to Pat or Miss Libby. So it doesn't apply to all white people. Or I think about my relationship with my sister and I'm like, that does not apply to my sister. So I think relationships is what is going to be part of the solution in breaking down these barriers. And so I do think the church has a role and a responsibility in the racial reconciliation and healing. Before we go, I would like to.
I want to just hit on that. I want to say rah what you said, because I just had that conversation about 3 weeks ago with another platform I was on, And that is so true, that it is only that one or few or whatever happens, but we cannot distinguish the whole group as to them doing something. And that goes, again, I'm speaking from, again, being that peacemaker perspective, that that's my advocacy, that we keep it in check. Because when we start doing that, that becomes very dangerous, and we actually end up losing our own ability to be an extender of what we're trying to do as reconcilers.
So before we wrap up, I just want to quickly give each of you just 1 minute. We can't be like the Baptist ministers and say, just give me a minute, and then it's an hour later. So I'm going to give you 1 minute to just wrap up and conclude what you would like to say. So I'll start with Dr. Bobby Huen.
Thank you, Sharmon. I just wanted to say that, I enjoyed your discussion about the role of church, but I also want to say that in order for that to be effective, especially during the pandemic, the church is not only needed to be diverse and teach people about empathy, but also must promote science. Right now, we see a lot of churches refuse to acknowledge COVID as a scientific thing. I read a blog where, there are lots of preachers saying mumbo jumbo that really has no basis in reality, but they want to reopen churches, they want to reopen the collection plates and blah, blah, blah. And I am appalled by some religious figures who are using the excuse of religion to promote theories that have no basis in reality. The truth is we are now, all of us are now trapped in various bubbles of our own making, thanks to social media, and we become echo chambers of our own opinions. So I think there's a moral imperative for authorities to believe in science, to reject conspiracy theories, to shut down any kind of fringe viewpoints in order for us to survive this pandemic. Once we survive this pandemic, we can reopen the churches and we can help promote racial reconciliation. But until then, we must get through this. We need to get through this pandemic first and foremost.
Thank you very much. That's so important, because we have to deal with the public health issue first before we can get back to dealing with all of the other issues that we face in this society. Okay, Dr. James, 1 minute.
Thank you. And being just a reminder, I come from a Christian perspective. That's my spiritual base and foundation. So I can put myself in this, my 1 minute, and I want to piggyback on Bobby, or just follow on Bobby, what you're saying. When you were talking, I thought about groupthink, the theory of groupthink, and how detrimental groupthink has been in our history. One of them that was very powerful, I was fairly, I won't say real young, but it was where it was a memory. And the fact that there was an engineer during the early 80s or mid 80s, and it was the Challenger space shuttle. And the engineers, they got together, and one engineer came in and said, you know what, that tile, I just am unsure about one part of if that tile's going to hold. It had something to do with the mechanics, and this one fray that he recognized. And everyone was so caught up and consumed in the excitement, and it was really unique because it had a broad spectrum of really citizens representing that were going up into space. And this one person tried to say, this is wrong, but yet the group battered him down and bullied him down to where he finally says, okay, okay. He just signed, very regrettingly, but and just resistantly, but he signed. And we know the rest, where we lost some wonderful souls. That just shows the power of groupthink. And so, Bobby, with what you're saying, I think it's important for us to recognize, going back to the church, because that was the conversation you had with me, is that it can be very dangerous. I don't care what spectrum of our society, be it schools, churches, politics, our personal lives, but in particular that groupthink can impact in even a negative way where there can be harm. And I think that's one of the things we've seen. And you've mentioned about the church and like decisions that are made. And so that is kind of my closing point is that, and from a Christian perspective, I don't advocate what man says to me, but I look at how the scripture has guided me as the compass of decision making. And I can only speak for myself, but that's what I see. And we can also extend that to even other readings and then collectively coming to a conclusion. God made us to make decisions on our own, because when we run with the group, sometimes the group can get us in trouble. And so that's my conclusion on that, that we just have to be independent with our thinking, and then from a church perspective, really not forget that it is scripture and not by what man says that really is our navigator. And that would be my insight on that. And I want to thank you for this wonderful opportunity, Sharmon and Bobby, me joining you.
Thank you. So I just want to end on, let's not be Chuck Woolery, the old TV game show host who said that COVID-19 is just a hoax. It's a ploy to harm President Trump. And then the very next day he posted, COVID is real. I'm sorry, my son has it. Let's extend empathy to one another, and let's be able to walk in each other's shoes without it impacting us directly first before we have empathy for one another. So my parting words is that I hope that you all learned something new, you took something from this, and that we all do our parts to heal and come together and reconcile. So thank you all, and thank my panelists, Dr. Wynona James and Dr. Bobby Huen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.